continue on our lecture about signal processing. We're going to go over digital signal processing. Digital signal processing is the use of digital processing, such as designed by computers or more specialized digital signal processors, to perform a wide variety of signal processing operations. So practically, what does that look like in our effects processing? Also, if you ever heard of the term DSP, that's what it stands for, digital signal processor. You find this in networking hardware for live events. You find this in soundboards that are digital. You find this in computers, in effect pedals, in effects units. Anything that is digital is going to have some sort of DSP when we're talking about audio. Now, there are hardware units that are digital, and here are a few. They're typically reverbs, delays, modulation. This Lexicon 480 is one of the most popular hardware unit. Digital reverbs, it was pretty much on everything in the 80s, as well as these AMS Neve had delays and reverbs that are very popular, and they make reissues of the AMS stuff, I know. And then this is a pitch shifting hardware unit, and from Eventide. So typically it's going to be modulation type things, reverbs, delays. That's what you're going to see in hardware units. There are some hardware units that are gain based as well, that are digital, but they're just not as prevalent. So here are the hardware units that are gain based, digital modelers. So digital modeler being a device, piece of software or plugin that emulates the coloration added to a signal by an amplifier, particularly an instrument amplifier, such as those used with guitars and bass guitars. So, as you'll see, the Line 6 Helix is probably the most popular one right now. That's kind of a floor unit that you can run guitar or bass through, and it does all your amplifier modeling, but it also does effects modeling. And then you have more specialized ones like the Kemper Profiler, that is pretty much just designed for modeling amp heads and cabs. So that is, they have a head unit that looks like an actual guitar head, and this is the rack unit. So they have both of those, and then typically there'll be a floor controller, kind of like with the Helix, that's on the floor as well. You don't have to have the floor controller with the Kemper stuff, but it is an optional thing. And then you also have pedals that are modelers. So Universal Audio has their series that has a Fender style amp simulator, a Vox amp simulator, and then they also have a Tweed Fender style amp simulator. So this is Blackface Fender style amp simulator. So the Universal Audio Strymon has a kind of all-in-one that has Round being Fender style, Chime being Vox style, Punch being Marshall style amps in a box there. So you have kind of three different colors in one, with the Iridium, and then the ACS is kind of similar to that. It has kind of the same three style as the Strymon does, but that's just a Walrus product. So these are kind of different in their functions. This is more of an all-in-one box. These are more used in configuration with other pedals and things like that. Kind of both of these are used in that way. And now this does have some effects built into it as well. The Kemper, so it's it's more similar to the Helix, but it's, in my opinion, it's just not known for is effects that are in there as much as the Helix is. But considering price, the Kemper is probably going to be the most expensive, followed closely by the Helix, and then these are going to be less money because they're more just amps simulation. All right, next thing to talk about is MIDI. So musical instrument digital interface. So this is a standard to transmit and store music, originally designed for digital music synthesizers. MIDI does not transmit recorded sounds. Instead, it includes musical notes, timings, pitch information, which the receiving device uses to play music from its own sound library. So, where do we see this most often? It's going to be in MIDI controllers. So these both are MIDI controllers, but the one that you're probably more familiar with is one that looks like a keyboard. So it assigns, if you have your virtual instrument, it assigns a note to each one of these, and you can pull it up in your MIDI track that is in Pro Tools. And you could be playing, say, a piano, a synthesizer, a guitar, a drum set, all from the MIDI controlled keys. It's important to know, reiterate that these controllers are just sending information. They're not sending sounds. So it's just what note am I playing, the timing of it, the pitch information, the velocity, those types of things is the only thing it's sending. And then the virtual instrument does the actual sound part. All right, let's talk about plugins. So in our effect processing journey here, there is basically everything that we've talked about so far has been modeled via virtual plugins. So this is going to be the lowest cost to entry into every one of the categories that I've mentioned in the last lecture, and talking about the digital hardware units in this lecture. So we're going to talk all through it, but this is going to be probably most of our experience with these hardware units are going to come in the form of the plug-in units, the model plug-in units. Not to say that I don't have some hardware units at home. Of course I do, and I use them regularly, but they're far more expensive than their plug-in counterparts. Okay, let's get into it. We can kind of identify some of these as well. These look to be here all Waves plugins, which Waves makes great plugins. Not just talking them up though. Steven Slate plugins are great. Universal Audio plugins are great. I personally use mostly Plugin Alliance plugins, which have a few different manufacturers in it, and they're all great. So there's plenty of different companies that make great plugins. But you see, this would be more like a SSL style channel strip here. So let's see the ones that are based off of hardware units. So this one is tape saturation. So that one is based off a hardware unit. This is going to be like a Neve style channel strip. preamp and everything. So that's off of a hardware unit. The Chef 73 is off a hardware unit. This is modeled to look like a hardware unit. I'm not sure if it is a hardware digital delay or not, but this one's clearly a Pultec EQ modeled. And then these ones look to be just software based, like these are just original creations. It's Butch Vig vocals up here, and everything like that. So let's talk about a couple of the advantages of plugins, okay? I just want to make sure. Okay, so they offer good and consistent sound quality. One of the advantages of plugins, yes, it does sound good, but also you do not have to worry about it breaking down like you do a hardware unit. That is a factor that is something you have to factor in when using hardware units, is the maintenance of them. They're not going to last forever in their current quality, and maybe when you buy one, it's already a vintage unit. Connections go out, buttons go out. Hopefully, the actual components that make the unit sound great will never go out, but transformers and diodes and everything need to be replaced sometimes, and you don't have to worry about that with plugins. So that's one thing. They're a fraction of the price of their hardware counterpart. Like I was saying earlier, it's the lowest barrier to entry that you can get for an analog type sound. That's going to be your plug-in units. For instance, you may have an 1176 style compressor that if you buy an original one, they go for about $10,000 now. So that's kind of a little out of price range for most people. So you end up buying a recreated one from a different company that they made that style of compressor. So if we go to a good solid company like Warm Audio and try to get 1176 compressor, I mean they sell it for pretty cheap. I think it's around $700 or $800. Some other companies even sell it for a little bit less. I believe there's a couple companies now, like Clark Technic's probably the lowest cost of any hardware manufacturer. They do in such big bulk numbers, and they're owned by Behringer, so it's they have the capital behind them to just do everything in bulk numbers. So they get their costs way down, and it's okay quality too. I have a couple of Clark Technic units. Still, your 1176 is going to be $300 for the cheapest one you can find, basically. Now, the plug-in version, if you buy Pro Tools, there's one that comes on it, free. There's a free 1176. If you want a little one that's perceived to be a little bit better than that, you can go to Plug-in Alliance and buy their 1176. I believe for around $30. So even the lowest cost hardware unit is going to cost about 10 times more than your plug-in unit. So that's probably the biggest advantage. Another thing is they typically offer more functions than the hardware units. So there are functions such as automation that you can do on plug-in units that you can't do on hardware units. So those automation capabilities are paramount to it, but also the ability to easily do side chaining, and sometimes they'll have filters and things that aren't on the actual hardware units. Here is another big advantage of a plug-in. It is that it's repeatable across unlimited number of channels. If I buy that 1176 from Clark Technic, I can only use it on the one channel at a time, you know. But if I buy the plugin from Plugin Alliance, I can use it on as many channels as I have in Pro Tools. You know, so that's a big advantage right there. Okay, let's talk about the categories of plugins. So in our gain-based ones, we have the preamp plugin. This is just like our hardware preamp. It colors the sound, usually gives it a little bit more harmonic information, makes it have a analog sound. Now, it's not going to make a huge difference just on one track. If you're listening to one track with and without it, you will be able to tell usually. But where it makes the biggest difference is when you start to put it on track after track after track in your mix, especially if it's a high track count project. It's going to build up that those harmonic content and really like vitalization and excitement through the analog modeled preamps in it. So preamp plugin I put on basically every track of my mix. It's the first thing. That or another plugin we'll talk about. But next thing, channel strip. This usually has a preamp, a EQ, a compressor / expander, sometimes a de-esser in it. This is basically modeling a channel strip from an analog mixing console that would have everything in line. So these are great plugins. I use the SSL channel strips all the time in my mix, and it makes it, again, going through a whole mix with channel strips on everything. It makes it sound like it has the sound of a SSL mixing console. And you know, there are things to do within it to kind of make some differentiated sounds, but it, you know, it's just a staple. So EQ is another one. I'm going to run through these kind of quickly now. So EQ, compressor, distortion, many great distortion plugins that are original to just digital format, and some that are modeled after hardware units. Saturation, same thing. Not the same thing as distortion. Distortion is kind of a more aggressive form, but same thing in that there are many great saturation units that are modeled after hardware units, and some that are just original to plugin form. Limiters, this kind of goes with compressor a little bit, but mastering limiters, and even like ones that you would use on individual tracks, they have great plug-in versions. Gates and expanders, de-essers, you would use these on vocals to get rid of some of the sibilance in a vocal that may be sticking out in the mix, make it sound more pleasing. Envelope shaper, this is basically a waveform shaper. And then transient designers, these are to do mainly with I use them a lot on drums, but it's basically where you can actually reconfigure kind of the transients that are within a waveform. And then obviously exciters, enhancers, these are a lot of these, preamps, saturators, exciters, they're very similar and can even, cross into different categories there. But, this is going to be having to do with the dynamics of exciters. All right, next would be filter. So we're still on gain-based. Filters are also usually found in equalizers as well. But your high-pass filter, low-pass filters. There are actually more specialized filters that you may use in your mix to get an effect. And then glitch, stutter, granular effects are used to get kind of weird tweaking out kind of sounds, or really like like a granular effect may make a waveform audio signal sound, like it's played from an old beat up vinyl or something like that, and that could be a cool sound in context, and then spectral analysis. So, that's kind of like real time spectral analysis. Now, time based. You obviously got your reverbs, your delays, then you get into your modulations, your choruses, flangers, phasers, tremolos, vibratos. We talked, a fair amount of about all these. So, but then you got your frequency shifters, your pitch shifters. Okay, frequency shifter takes a frequency and obviously shifts it. Pitch shifter does the same thing with your pitch. These two can kind of be in the same category. And then any other kind of modulators, some weird, off-the-wall modulators out there that just exist in plugin form that I wanted to include there. And then a big thing is stereo width. So this isn't necessarily time-based with it, stereo width, and neither really is the frequency shifters and stuff. But it's more not gain-based, I guess. It falls in the other category. But the great thing about stereo width plugins is it gives more dimension to your mix. I put it on the master bus sometimes. It all depends on the project you're going with. And vocoder is a good plugin you can use on really anything that's designed for vocals. Okay, let's talk about the signal chains. So if we have our regular instrument track, all right, so we're going to talk about signal chain on a different track type basis. So if you just have a general audio track that is instrument or a vocal, this is going to be your order of effects, of processing. So, first thing you're going to start off with, if you have any pitch shift, meaning auto-tune, meaning any kind of octave effect, or high or low octave effect, or harmony effect, you're going to want to put that first, so it is able to track that pitch shift correctly. If you start putting things that mess with the harmonics and mess with the signal, it's not going to be able to track that as accurately. So that's why you put pitch shift first. Next thing you would have would be tape saturation. I put this on pretty much all of my tracks. I use a plugin called Heat in Pro Tools, but they also make mini tape saturation simulators as plugins that you can put on tracks. Heat's just convenient because it comes with Pro Tools. It sounds pretty good, and it actually, you can set it to where it's on every track if you want to. And it just runs off of one engine. So tape saturation, it's just simulating a tape machine that would have been used with analog consoles back in the day. Why would you want to emulate that? Because it makes it sound more analog, more real, as opposed to colder and more digital sounding. So put tape saturation if it fits the song, after pitch shift, or first if you don't have any pitch shift. Next would be your preamp plugin. Then your EQ plugin, and then your compression. Okay. Then any gate, de-esser, or active EQ. Now, these 4 things right here are typically found in a channel strip. So the channel strip could replace all these three things right here as well. Usually not active EQ, that's not usually in a channel strip, but it's kind of in the same vein as a gate and a de-esser, the active EQ. If we haven't talked about active EQ before, it is basically an EQ that is only activated when a source reaches a certain level in whichever frequency range the EQ is set up for. So one thing that I use active EQ for a lot is on a vocal, instead of using a de-esser in certain situations, or if I've already used a de-esser, I will then put another plug-in on, an active EQ, and go to where the vocal's sounding a little harsh in the mix and duck it out a little bit when the vocalist is really singing. That way, it's not there all the time when the vocalist is a little lower. It just works as the vocalist gets really loud. It just ducks some in that certain frequency range. Now, modulation is next. So modulation comes after any gain-based effects. So this is your flangers, your phasers, choruses, tremolos, vibratos. Well, tremolo is kind of its own thing, and we'll talk about that next. But any of those kind of pitch shifting, swirly type effects are going to go after any saturation, overdrive, or distortion. Then tremolo comes next, depending on style. I usually put tremolo after modulation, but if you're in a more, depending on the style. So for instance, if you're in a surf rock band, for instance, they always have tremolo last, because in the old Fender amplifiers, the tremolo was always after the reverb, and that was kind of the sound of in the old reverb units as well. That was kind of the sound of it. So it just depends on the style. You can move that tremolo around. And then after tremolo, you'd have delay, any kind of delay or echo, and then your reverb. You have reverb last typically because it just kind of softens everything else. Everything runs into the reverb, softens everything, gives it a pleasing sort of decay. And so this is your signal chain for just your traditional track, your instrument, your vocal. In Pro Tools, you just, your audio track. This is your signal chain. Now, when we talk about a bus, here's the signal chain. Now, this is going to be instrument bus, meaning you have a group of instrument tracks. They all run into a bus as like a master bus, or it can be a parallel compression bus or an effects bus. But any kind of bus is typically the chain, and I'm going to go through the different types here too. But one tape saturation, bus preamp, an EQ. Typically, I only use the EQ for any kind of corrective thing. So if I have a drum bus, for instance, and I run all my drums into that bus, I have my tape saturation, my preamp, and then I'm listening to it, and all my individual tracks are EQ'd pretty well, but there's just something unpleasant in the high end when all of them come together. Then I'll put a little EQ on that bus track and take it out of the whole drum mix. You think of it as a master track for that instrument group. And then you want your bus compression. This is a bit different from regular compression. There are specialized compressors that are just bus compressors, and that's what you're going to want to use. Next, a compression bus. So you'll notice this is kind of like a master for the group, like a group bus. I still put bus compression on it, but it's kind of light. It's maybe taking down 1 to 3 dB, and maybe I'd only have it at 3 to 1 or so. Now the parallel compression bus, I'm going to have it at a higher ratio, the compression. So I'll go ahead and get there. Preamp, bus compression, and then the bus compression is going to be typically at a higher ratio, say an 8-to-1 or a 10-to-1, and then I'm going to be still bringing it 3 to 6 dB down, set my threshold there, and then any additional compression would come after that. So if I'm really wanting to slam a vocal parallel compressor or a drum parallel compressor, I'd put maybe 1176 on there and put it in all-in mode and just slam it. And then I would bring the fader of that bus compressor to where it sounds pleasing in the overall mix. You're not going to be hearing primarily that compression bus. You'll be hearing it blended in with the instrument bus. And then after any additional compression, if applicable, you put some saturation. So if you really want to slam it again and make it kind of sound dirty, and then just bring it up and blend it in, sometimes I'll put an amp simulation or a black box or character simulate saturator on there, something like that. Now for your effects buses, again, you have preamp, any kind of modulation, then delay, then reverb. So it kind of follows that, the effect part, it follows the same kind of order as your individual track. Now let's talk about the master bus. That's where it gets a little different. So master bus is where you hear the term mastering. Sometimes you will put very limited things on your master bus, your master fader, and then send it off to get mastered. This, what I'm going to show you, is if you are mastering it yourself. So first, any kind of tape saturation. Then I put an actual saturation unit on it. I personally use black box, set very low, but it's on my master bus the whole time. Any kind of preamp. Then I will put a Pultec EQ on it. I'll raise up the lows a little bit, raise up the highs a little bit on that EQ, but I like the sound of a Pultec EQ on my master bus. And typically I'll have all these things going while I'm mixing the other tracks. And then a lot of times you'll put a light compressor, so something like a 2-to-1 ratio or 3-to-1 ratio. And then you'll put your mastering compressor, which is typically there's many different plugins out there that are mastering compressors, but it's typically a little higher ratio, and there's just many more options with it, but it's made to bring up the level to like a commercial radio level. And then at the end, stereo widener makes your mix sound a little wider, and also sometimes it's built into the mastering compressor.